Hello, political geographers. Welcome back to part 2 lecture on the war on drugs. So you've just watched the trailer for Break the Taboo, which is a documentary produced by the Global Commission on Drug Policy that produced the report that you read for today. It has a lot of interesting statistics. It illustrates that both parties, Republican and Democrat, have pursued war on drugs policies, and it highlights some of the cost. And what we're going to get to in this lecture are some of the alternative ideas covered by the Global Commission on Drug Policy in their report. That's the alternative to the war on drugs, and Break the Taboo is one of those ideas that the Global Commission on Drug Policy has. Essentially, we have to first admit that the war on drugs has been a failure. And we need to change the discourse. We need to change the message from one of being a war, of a battle, of about being crime, to a discourse about patience, about addiction, about recovery. And when we change the discourse, when we change what's defined as the problem, right, addiction, rather than criminal action, the solutions also fall from how we define the problems. So let's get into it. The video mentioned $2.5 trillion. I've heard estimates of closer to $3 trillion have been spent on the war on drugs, and yet, as the trailer suggests today, more people are consuming. Drugs are more pure. The cost has remained the same, if not gone up, for the price of drugs. But today what we have, and will be the focus of the discussion on Wednesday, is that the illegal market of drugs has, combined with the war on drugs, has produced a really powerful set of actors, which are drug trafficking organizations. So one of the unintended consequences of the war on drugs has been the creation, proliferation, and enrichment of organized crime. That's where we're going to head on Wednesday. Let's focus on the alternative to the war on drugs as described by the Global Commission on Drug Policy and others. Now, it's true that the heroin crisis in the United States has prompted some sympathy and some renegotiation of these ideas of criminality, of incarceration, and the heroin crisis has resulted in a little bit more sympathetic and subtler, gentler discourse about drugs and drug problems. At the same time, however, we have recent leadership in the United States. When Jeff Sessions was Attorney General, he actually was bringing back many of the tough get war on drugs, lock them up, mandatory minimums, et cetera, et cetera. During the Reagan administration, as you learned in the last lecture, Reagan in 1986 with the Anti-Drug Abuse Act created a very difficult situation across the entire country, whereby if people were caught in possession of even small amounts of crack cocaine, 5 grams, and marijuana as well, was given sort of a threshold of a mandatory minimum sentence, and people were sent to jail for a minimum of 5 years without parole. For crack addicts living in largely the city centers of the United States, this meant that just having 5 grams, one hit of crack, could land them in federal prison for 5 years. And guess what? This was during the time of 3 strikes, you're out. And in Georgia, it's 2 strikes, you're out. 2 strikes, 2 felonies, you're in prison for life. That means that potentially a person who was popped for possession, small possession of drugs twice in the state of Georgia could face life in prison. And if you don't care about the impacts on that individual person and the injustice that that would mean for them, think about the cost to the American social system of incarcerating people for life rather than investing money in treatment and rehabilitation whenever possible. That's the argument here. So we have seen this debate go back and forth. And during the Obama administration, there were some revisions to the penal code to reduce, to decriminalize drug consumption, to offer drug deferment through the court system, meaning that people would get education and treatment rather than jail time if they're a first-time offender or a small possession offender, meaning that they're consuming rather than trafficking or dealing. But with Jeff Sessions, there was an uptick on the criminalization of small-scale possession, even within the context of the heroin epidemic, the opioid epidemic here in the United States. In other places, for example, in the Philippines, this sort of war on drugs approach has also been implemented. This is not just a debate that's happening within the United States, although the US as a leader has really funded and propagated this military-based approach to the drug problem around the world. But certainly there are human rights abuses occurring in places like the Philippines, where the current president there has been accused of engaging in social cleansing and extrajudicial killings of drug addicts. So the idea here is that these militarized approaches implemented in the US and also in other places, that they not only have failed, but they have backfired tremendously. And so what is the other option? Okay, so of course we've been talking about decriminalization, but also you have heard debates about legalization, or even aware that in some states in our country that not only is recreational or medicinal marijuana legal, but also now recreational, meaning that you don't need a medical reason to purchase and consume. But what is the difference between legalization and decriminalization? It's really important that you understand the difference, right? Decriminalization doesn't mean that it's legal. You can't go to a store and legally purchase that controlled substance. It means that decriminalization means that if you are found having possession of drugs on you, defined up to a certain limit, small scale possession of a drug, that you would not have to face jail time, harsh legal punishment, but rather, yes, you would enter the criminal justice system perhaps and face a judge, but you would be given the opportunity of drug deferment, meaning that you get education and treatment, or even in some cases, small-scale possession of some substances like marijuana would require no legal action or punishment on the part of the police officer. That's very different than legalization, right? Legalization means that the state has said that this is a legal market rather than an illegal market, and thus the state is going to tax and control its production and consumption. That is what we have with tobacco and alcohol in this country, a legally controlled, taxed drug. And that is what has happened in many states around this country where marijuana has been legalized. Now the state is not only not punishing people for small-scale possession and consumption, but is monitoring and regulating the production of that substance. So those are two different policy options, but those are not the only two, okay? A much more in-depth explanation and approach to an alternative to the war on drugs is what's laid out for you in the report, War on Drugs report on the Global Commission on Drug Policy. I have my copy here. I encourage you to read this report. It's really fascinating, and it gives you, I think, what is the most useful, practical, and demonstrated with evidence what a health-based alternative is to the war on drugs. Let me say that again. The Global Commission on Drug Policy is proposing a public health-based alternative to the war on drugs. Their strategy is based on harm reduction. Okay, so let's take a look at where we're headed with this lecture. In terms of the approach of the Global Commission on Drug Policy. So let's ask, who makes up the Global Commission on Drug Policy? What alternatives to the war on drugs do they suggest? What are the unintended consequences, or that should say unintended consequences to the war on drugs? What evidence does the Global Commission on Drug Policy use to support their argument that alternatives to criminalization are better at reducing drug use, drug-based crimes, and addiction? And what policy approaches do you support? You can be darn sure that I'm going to give you a lot of information about the existing approaches with the war on drugs, the alternative harm reduction and public health-based approaches proposed by the Global Commission. And then I'm going to ask you at some point to reflect on which policy, which approach do you agree with and why, and of course to draw on some supporting evidence to support your position. But just returning to this picture, the Global Commission of Drug Policy is made up of several dozen high-level heads of state, and we have here Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the United Nations. We have heads of state from, I think, Switzerland, from Colombia, and of course, Richard Van Branson here. He's one of the few private sector people on the board who's a member of this Global Commission, but this is what they've done. And what's really interesting is they've only taken former presidents, former heads of international organizations, and of course the Virgin Enterprise, Richard Branson, to have an elite group of individuals who are sharing this message. So this is not an academic publication by a professor at Texas State like myself. This it's important that you understand the political weight that this group has, because that also influences the potential of this organization to shape drug policy globally and the work that they're doing. Okay. So some of the unintended consequences of the war on drugs. Let me see here. Okay, so the unintended consequences, let me see. I want to put this somewhere else. I won't do it like this. Okay, thanks for your patience. I hope you're all well. Okay, so unintended consequences. So the war on drugs, I've told you, between $2.5–3 trillion since the war on drugs started in the 1970s, was 71 with the declaration of the war on drugs by Richard Nixon. In 1973, the DEA is created. Here we are in 2020, $3 trillion, nearly $3 trillion. We'll see if this money has solved the global drug problem. The answer, of course, is no, and we're going to get some stats on that. But I also want you to think about the unintended consequences, okay? Some of the unintended consequences of the war on drugs is that it has created a huge criminal black market, okay? Number one, we talked about this. I actually study these criminal organizations. I know a little bit about them. We're going to talk about that in the next lecture. But certainly in Central America alone, 7 tiny little countries, the cocaine trade The cocaine trade, not counting marijuana, not counting heroin, $6 billion a year. It's alongside remittances, that narco capital sloshes around in those economies and creates a lot of power for drug traffickers to buy political campaigns, to buy land. The consequences are huge. With military interdiction, the use of military force to try to stop and seize the flow of drugs coming into this country, what it does is it increases the cost of transaction, the cost of business for the cartels, and also enables them to create a monopoly on an illegal market. Those things combine to allow them to set the price of cocaine at any level, right? So this creates a huge criminal black market. Number two, policy displacement. The result of using scarce resources to fund a vast enforcement effort intended to address this criminal market. Okay, extensive policy displacement. What this is that what this means is that the $2.5 to $3 trillion could have been spent elsewhere. Policy displacement. All that money was spent on this policy, where that $3 trillion could have been focused on addiction, physical health, etc., education for young people, all sorts of services that might prevent people from becoming addicted to drugs in the first place. For every $1 that's spent on addiction and recovery, many more dollars, I think it's $4, I think the ratio is 3 to 1, maybe 4 to 1, is spent on military interdiction, supply-based strategies. It's very expensive to engage in the practice of military addiction abroad. A lot of aid money from the United States takes the shape of military hardware and training, etc., to work with Central American governments to fight the war on drugs as the US defines it. Geographic displacement. This is really important, people. The balloon effect. The balloon effect. I can't believe I don't have a balloon around me. I'm such a geographer. My kids were having this lesson here. Here I am in my home. I don't have a balloon handy. But I want you to imagine a balloon, right? What happens when you squeeze a balloon? Does it pop? Is it destroyed? Does it go away? No, it doesn't. What happens is the air shifts somewhere else. And that's exactly what happens with the balloon effect with drug trafficking. I do study this extensively in my research, and it's the reason that drug traffickers end up in protected areas in national parks, because they're playing a cat and mouse game of interdiction, trying to hide, escape, find remote territories where they can land planes and boats and traffic drugs. And this creates the balloon effect, whereby if one drug trafficking node gets shut down or military forces show up, the drug traffickers don't pack up and go home. They look for new smuggling routes elsewhere. And we're going to find that controlling some strategic smuggling routes, which are called plazas, really important strategic, these are around borders, international borders, water borders, maritime borders. There are some territories that are really key, like getting across the US-Mexican border. And the drug trafficking cartels will fight each other to the death, killing civilians and anybody else caught in a crossfire to gain control of those territories. So the geography to drug trafficking and the violence that's related, all of this is tied up with the fact that this is an illegal market, that drug traffickers exploit and use violence and criminal approaches to get drugs into the United States and Europe, et cetera, okay? The balloon effect. Drug production shifts location to another location to avoid the attention of law enforcement. Number 3. Okay, number 4. Another unintended consequence, substance displacement, or the movement of consumers to new substances when their previous drug of choice becomes difficult to obtain. Okay, so for example, Think about the meth epidemic in the United States. Okay, so by focusing on simply prohibiting people from consuming drugs and punishing them rather than treating the source of their addiction and removing the demand for drugs, or you can't remove it. You can reduce the demand for drugs. Harm reduction. You reduce without, okay, so the idea is that if you're still just focusing on the supply, stop the supply, and you don't address the demand for drugs, even if you cut off the supply of one drug, that society, that individual, that addict is just going to go to another substance. So even though the clamping down of access to the materials used to make methamphetamines, both, us as individuals having to sign our names and give our IDs to buy Sudafed and things like that, and also regulations buying from Mexico. U.S. citizens didn't reduce their overall drug consumption. They simply moved to different substances. And of course, after the meth epidemic, we had the opioid epidemic that we're still experiencing right now. So that's what they mean by substance displacement. And then lastly, the perception and treatment of users who are stigmatized, marginalized, and excluded. Okay, this is actually really important. When you talk about drug use and abuse through a criminal lens rather than the lens of addiction and public health, those people who are drug addicts are seen and often see themselves as criminals rather than as people with health problems. And this has implications for not only the stigmatization of drug users and drug addicts, but also in terms of how insurance companies and different people respond to whether or not they're willing to fund the treatment of people who are experiencing drug addiction issues. Okay. So it looks like I have Casey here coming online. The idea, folks, here is that maybe we could figure out a way for you to join me while I'm taping this. Hi, Casey. I hope you're well. This is my channel on Zoom, but you do not have to watch this live. I'm taping this, and I can download it and post it for you, but you're welcome to listen along if you like. Okay, so what evidence does the Global Commission on Drug Policy use to support their arguments? Well, they're arguing that the war on drugs has failed, and excuse me, that the war on drugs has failed, and that this health-based policy, harm reduction policy-based approach is a better alternative. They argue that they have proof because after 50 years nearly of the war on drugs, people today are consuming more opioids, more cocaine, and more cannabis than ever before. You sort of look here at the estimates on the part of the UN for annual drug consumption, and you'll see that there's been an increase across just these three categories. So despite the $3 trillion, despite all of the efforts to stop people consuming through these criminal-based approaches, military-based approaches, people today are still consuming. And indeed, we have an increase in drug consumption. So some of the evidence that harm reduction policies are working, well, let's first of all talk a little bit about what are harm reduction policies, right? Harm reduction policies are the alternative policies to the war on drugs as a military effort that focus not on criminalizing people, arresting people for small-scale possession and consumption, but spend money and create policies that reduce the overall public harm that drug consumption and drug addiction produces. So what are some of the examples of the harm reduction strategies? Well, we talked about the use of analogs like methadone for people who are trying to get off of an opioid, a heroin addiction. Methadone can be part of a treatment program, right? That was outlawed in the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act, but thankfully in many states across this country, people are receiving methadone treatment, I think including here in Texas. Another example of a harm reduction strategy is the provision of needle exchanges. So a needle exchange, maybe does anybody know what a needle exchange is? Right, that's the idea that drug addicts who use intravenous drug addicts can go to there are sometimes medical facilities, nonprofit organizations run clean needle exchanges, and without providing any ID or fear of arrest, these individuals can bring dirty needles in and receive clean needles in return. And this is what you see as the impact of, and another really amazing sort of, it's hard to believe these places exist, but there are actually drug consumption rooms in some cities. I know that there are some in many European cities like Frankfurt, I even think perhaps in Seattle, but don't quote me on that, where drug addicts can actually, it's like a needle exchange, but it actually allows a place for people to come in and safely consume drugs. And while that seems wild, given the war on drugs world we grow up in, what's interesting is that at the same time, those individuals are being put in contact with a public health worker, and they're getting information about treatment services. They're oftentimes being tested for other diseases or getting support from homeless services, food banks. It's sort of, it is a tactic that that both gets them a clean needle, a safe place to stay, and 3, to put them into contact with the public health system. So the Global Commission on Drug Policy draws on some statistics largely from the United Nations that looks at how these public health reduction strategies actually impact society, right? So what we see here is the impact of drug policies on recent HIV prevalence among people who inject drugs. So here's an example up top of some of the countries where harm reduction policies have been implemented, comprehensive harm reduction policies. This means that in the UK, Switzerland, Germany, and Australia, that less than 5%, and in some places it looks like 3 to 4% of intravenous drug users have HIV. In countries that have introduced harm reduction strategies partially or late in the HIV epidemic, you see that that number is between 10 and 15%. But when we look at countries that have consistently banned any harm reduction strategies like clean needle exchanges, you see that the HIV rate of intravenous drug users is more than 40% in Thailand and more than 35% in Russia. So when we think about the global drug problem as a public health issue that can be addressed through harm reduction strategies, suddenly the discourse changes. And this is what the Global Commission on Drug Policy means by break the taboo. It's almost like break the discourse, end the war. Let's stop talking about it as a war. It's not a war, it's a public health crisis. And that includes the violence and homicide rates that plague Central America. We'll come back to that on Wednesday. And really, I'm going to explain to you based on my research and what I've seen and what I've been told about the relationship between the war on drugs, drug trafficking, and violence in Central America. Okay, so let me move forward here. discrepancy. So this is also coming from the report. This looks familiar to you if you've done your reading. What you can see here is that this was a report that was done in 2007 by a team of global scientists who actually looked at how the UN classifies drugs in terms of which ones are illegal, which ones are the most harmful, which ones are illegal, which ones are the most harmful to society, versus how this independent team looked at levels of control versus levels of harm, okay? So what you see here, basically, this independent expert assessment, these independent experts from this report, they basically ranked the impact of these drugs on people and society from worst to least harmful, okay? And then they contrast that with how the United States classifies these drugs versus most dangerous to low risk, okay? And which substances, which drugs are not controlled internationally at all. So what's interesting, of course, is that alcohol rates higher than cannabis, LSD, Ritalin, in terms of its impact, but yet there are no strict regulations, right? Heroin, cocaine, the most harmful barbiturates are ranked as being very harmful to society. These are like your pill poppers, your downers, stuff like that, seen as low risk by the UN. What they're getting at is that how we think about what's illegal and what's legal and illegal does not match up with the impact on society. Yes, heroin and cocaine, that's not surprising, but cannabis is low down the list, but yet the UN classifies it as the most dangerous. And for any of you who have spent time in the Netherlands, what's really interesting to me is that there they have a discourse of hard drugs versus soft drugs. The way that they educate people is that soft drugs like marijuana and alcohol are legal and regulated. You shouldn't do them, but if you are, this is what you need to understand the impacts to be. And but then they talk about hard drugs as the sort of line that's crossed to getting into very extremely dangerous different types of substances. What we're getting at here is that the level of impact on society doesn't necessarily reflect with how people think about what's illegal, what's not legal, and their impact. And of course, if we were in class, most of you would agree that alcohol, despite the fact that it's legal, has some of the most negative impacts on society, not just in terms of people's health, but in terms of drunk driving and domestic violence and just all, I mean, what a horrible, horrible, horrible drug alcohol is. And indeed, in our country, we tried to prohibit it, but ultimately that created a large criminal organization, and the state learned that it was best to try to control the beast rather than to eradicate it altogether. So let's go ahead and move on. Okay, so what are the policy reforms proposed by the Global Commission on Drug Policy? Well, as I've said several times, they argue that we should focus on demand reduction, reduce the demand through education, through drug rehabilitation, through treatment, and to implement harm reduction strategies. How do we minimize the negative impact on society of drug consumption and addiction? Break the taboo and stigmatization and criminalization of drug addiction. We need to treat drug addicts as patients rather than as criminals. Challenge misconceptions. Really, go back to that argument about sort of how do we think about drugs, and maybe the best way to educate our youth is not to just say no to everything, but to really educate them on what are the risks, how are drugs different, what are the different risks that different types of drugs bring, including alcohol. Decriminalize nonviolent drug offenses. This is a big piece of it. The Global Commission on Drug Policy advocates that small-scale users, first-time a small scale possession and even first time dealers should be given alternative sentences that would really enable them to rehabilitate their lives, either through drug deferment court, counseling, job court, training, whatever the case may be. But the idea is that rather than putting in the prison pipeline, that we want to try to put them on the back track, on the right track. So what they're advocating is not to decriminalize drug trafficking, only nonviolent drug possession charges. Half of the people in the US criminal justice system today are there on nonviolent drug charges. I told you 25% of the world's population is incarcerated in the United States. Let me say that again. The US has 5% of the world's population, 25% of the world's incarcerated population. Half of that number, nonviolent drug offenses. Not working, not working. It's expensive for society. It ruins people's lives. There are even people probably in this class who had a small drug possession charge earlier in their life and thus are excluded from getting those federal aid programs like Pell Grants, right? So this idea of decriminalizing nonviolent drug offenses and just spend the police, military, money, and judicial systems focus on going after traffickers, okay? Let's distinguish between small-scale drug users and drug addicts and criminal organizations like drug cartels, okay? That's the argument. Consider legal regulation for cannabis and perhaps other drugs. We're going to talk about legal regulation for cannabis and what's happening around the country in just a minute. Criminal and military focuses on drug traffickers, not consumers. Yes, okay. Alternative sentences for small-scale and first-time dealers, and invest in evidence-based prevention. Okay. So let's talk about the policy of legalization, okay? So what we have here in this graph is the economic impact of the US cannabis industry from 2013 to 2020. And we can see here, this is the legal cannabis industry in the United States, okay? This is not the value of the illicit cannabis industry. All right, so we have dispensary store sales. Here we're talking in billions of dollars in 2013. The dispensaries and the stores, and then if you add on the economic impact of those dispensaries and stores, the additional services, the backward-forward linkages that economy has, you're looking at in 2013, the US marijuana industry was for $6.4 total $1 billion rather. And you can see very clearly the upward trajectory of that industry. So, you know, today we are looking at this graph is a little bit old, but in 2019, the estimate of the economic impact of the marijuana industry is between $20 and $38 billion a year. So the point here is that not only do advocates suggest that decriminalizing marijuana would have positive impacts, but that legalizing creates a whole bunch of revenue, and that revenue is actually often reinvested back into society because it is a state-regulated sale rather than criminal organizations retaining the profit. The state is making a lot of money in profit and investing often in drug education and drug rehabilitation and drug addiction services. So there's some interesting ways to think about, gosh, you know, where do you get money for these public health programs, this public health alternative that the Global Commission on Drugs is proposing. And one of the answers is, well, geez, you're saving a whole lot of money by not incarcerating nonviolent drug offenders. But then, of course, we have examples from states like Washington, Colorado, and California, where marijuana tax revenues are funding drug education and drug treatment services. So, you know, this is an estimation of what that market might look like and just the amount of taxes that the US could generate based on legalizing and taxing marijuana. But of course, that's an estimate. This is 2016, just to give you sort of a geography of where, this is now a little bit outdated, things have changed, but what's interesting to note here is that not only are some of the wealthiest states getting those profits, but that it really matters sort of where you are in terms of legalization, because when you think about the legalization of marijuana's impact on organized crime, I mean, another sort of argued benefit of legalization versus decriminalization is that with legalization, then the state can legally sanction and monitor and regulate marijuana production by legal producers rather than drug traffickers. And so, in effect, by legalizing, the profits that would have gone to drug traffickers then go to marijuana farmers and to the state that collects revenue, right? And then that disempowers the cartels. But of course, you know, it doesn't really make that much of an impact. He's outside. Doesn't make that much of an impact. It doesn't make as much of an impact in terms of the power of cartels and their revenues if marijuana is not legalized in Texas versus up here in the Northeast. So we can really think about sort of, you know, how their role and the importance that the southern border states play in this debate, because arguably the demand for marijuana in those states could come from legal sources rather than illegal sources. And then this, you know, we're just sort of wrapping up here, but I will mention that, you know, when we think about that number of mass incarceration in the United States and that half of the people are nonviolent drug consumers, drug possessors, you know, that what's going to blow your mind is that precisely those 3 states that had border Mexico, more people are arrested for marijuana possession than any other drug. So, you know, you don't have to think about drug policy and its impact always at the federal level. There are really important differences between states and between substances, okay? So, let me see here. What I want to just end with here is the, let me share my screen one more time. I want you to watch one more little clip before you finish your engagement with the lecture today. And it is the history of the war on drug. And it was produced by the Global Commission on Drug Policy. I am going to put a link in our folder for you to easily link to this 5-minute cartoon, but it is a brilliant representation of so many things that we have been talking about in today's lecture. It captures the unintended consequences, the cost of the war on drugs, and it also sets us up for some more language that we're going to look at on Wednesday. But I'm going to ask you to take a look at that and to watch that clip. I will provide the link for you in the folder. And maybe what I'll do too, I've got a couple people sort of zooming in. Maybe what I'll do is start holding the classes at a regular time and allowing you all to chime in. So I'm going to stop recording now. Hi, Jacob. Hi, Clay. Hi, Casey. And let me think about maybe, you know, I could record these lectures during the regularly scheduled program. So that would be a way that maybe we could have a little bit more interactive lecture. Okay, but until then, I'm going to get this ready to post on YouTube for everybody else. I'm wishing you all of the best. Please post your questions about this lecture or about the online transition in our forums page, and I will see you again soon.